Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining. Today, we're introducing some technical aspects of the SAWGraph project. So SAWGraph stands for the Safe Water and Agricultural Products Graph. It's part of the Proto-OKN cohort to develop a prototypical open knowledge network. The SAWGraph project is specifically a joint effort between the University of Maine, Kansas State, and the Rue Institute, as well as federal agencies, in particular EPA and state agencies partners. SAWGraph consists at its back end of 6 interconnected graphs. There's a graph for chemical substances of interest, in particular PFAS substances, shown here in yellow, one for PFAS observations, shown in purple, and the pink one shows the facilities and industry classifications from EPA's Facility Registry Service. The green graph is contains spatial information about the 48 lower states with state, county, and town boundaries, and the blue graph contains hydrological information about surface water, aquifers, and wells. So there's the sixth one that is about crops and soil. Right now, this is only populated with crop information about what crops are grown. We will be going over some of the ontologies that actually power this graph. So these are color-coded here the same way the graphs are shown in the previous slide. You have the yellow one here starting the chemical entities, the chemical substances, and then we will continue with the PFAS knowledge graph, the contaminants, the FIO, which is the facilities and industries, and then move over to the spatial at the bottom and the hydrology graphs before we end with the soil, with the crop graphs. So the first part of the graph is the PFAS ontology, and YZ will be presenting that.
Hello, my name is Yinglun Zhang, and I'm a PhD student from the Concordant Lab at Kansas State University under the supervision of Dr. McGinty. My work on the SAWGraph project focuses on developing the ComTox ontology, which is a structured knowledge framework for integrating mainly EPA's PFAS data. Based on the curated data, we designed and implemented the ComTox ontology. It provides a formal representation of PFAS chemicals and connects them to their physicochemical and environmental fate properties. We use consistent identifiers, including DSS tox IDs and CAS registry numbers to ensure clear and reliable linking across multiple data sources. This slide gives an overview of the resulting ontology structure. As of now, the ComTox ontology contains around 70 classes and 18 data properties supported by 82 logical axioms. This matrix reflects a focused but very well-defined module that captures PFAS-specific chemical and their property information, which is designed to integrate seamlessly with the broader SAWGraph. For the ontology development, we follow the knowledge acquisition and representation methodology, or NARM. NARM is an agile iterative methodology with 9 steps, combining both manual and automated ontology building. In our case, we began with the sub-language analysis of EPA's ComTox data and PFAS terminology, and then we collaborated with domain experts through a iterative metadata modeling. Once the structure was agreed upon, we then used the semi-automated tools and scripts to build the ontology, and then we validated it within the GraphDB using competency questions and Spark QL queries. This iterative circle helped ensure that the ontology accurately captures the domain knowledge. And this figure here shows the hierarchical structure of the ontology that we built by applying the norm methodology. The ontology brings together the data from the DSS Talks database and the ComTalks dashboard. Where the experimental data is not available, we also include the predicted values from the opera models. And it shows how chemical entities connect with their physicochemical properties, exposure information, and environmental fate data. We use multiple chemical identifiers such as DTX-ICID, Cas number, PubChem-CID, InchiKey, and SMILES to ensure the data can be linked and queried consistently across sources. We also developed this structure through multiple rounds of discussion with domain experts to make sure that it reflects the important relationships needed for PFAS monitoring and decision-making. Next slide, please. And here is an example screenshot of the ontology's class hierarchy and annotations. PFAS chemicals are organized by their chemical categories, such as perfluoroalkyl acids. Each chemical class is annotated with standardized identifiers from EPA's DSS Talks database, including Cas numbers, DTX SIDs, PubChem CIDs, and InchiKeys, as well as key physicochemical attributes like their carbon chain length, functional groups, and SMILE strings. This structured representation makes the PFAS data interoperable and machine-readable, supporting more sophisticated querying and integrating with other datasets in the SAWGraph project. Thank you, and that was my part.
So next we'll talk a little bit about the ontology powering the main SAWGraph graph, also sometimes referred to as the PFAS graph. I'm Katrina Schweikert, a PhD student at University of Maine in the School of Computing and Information Science in the Skylab. So the backbone of the observation graph is a ontology that we've named Contaminoso. So this is really an extension of SOSA, which is an ontology about observations and measurements. And we're extending this to support observations about chemical contaminants, specifically in our case, PFAS chemicals. So the main sort of central feature in this graph is the observations, which are contaminant observations. We have two types in our graph. Samples that are taken in the environment of PFAS, so such as sampling water or sampling a field, sampling animals and livestock and things like that. And then also release observations. So where we know that a chemical has been released into the environment, this is typically some kind of volume or ton measurement as opposed to a concentration for the sample observations. So each of these observations has additional information attached to it, such as the contamination property, the analysis method that was used, and I'll go into more detail specifically about the sample, how we define the sample, and the feature of interest. So starting from the left to the right here, the sample is kind of central to understanding what exactly was sampled in the environment. In the case of a sample observation, obviously not a release. So this is a material sample that we specify with some kind of sample material type. So in order to support queries more advanced about different types of samples, for example, all root vegetables or all fish tissue, we align these sample material types to Foodon and NCBI taxon from OboFoundry, so that you can query them by all sets of categories that would be logical. So also central to this contaminant ontology is two different types of features that we might have of interest. So we have our main feature of interest. The thing that we're sampling might be a well or a field or a water body. And then we also want to know specifically where it was sampled, so the sample point. So we differentiate these by the COSO feature and the COSO point. And an extension of SOSA, in order to support connection to the PFAS graph with all of the chemical informatics that were just discussed, we also have a specific COSO substance that links to the PFAS ontology. And then the measurement we'll go into more detail about on the next slide. So we follow the QUDT model to specify more information about measurement in an ontology. So we separate out the unit and the value. And we've also made an important distinction here between non-detect values and detect values. So for chemical sampling, that's a very important distinction where there's not a numerical result for a non-detect, but it is still a very important result that it was tested and it was not able to be observed above the detection limit. And then also on the right-hand side here, you can see some important qualifiers for our measurement, including the detection limit and the quantitation limit. So these values are really contextualized based on this specific type of sampling that was done and what the precision was of the measurement at that time. So the Contaminoso ontology is extended by each of the data sets that we've imported. So each of these is subclass so that you can build specific queries based on specific sets of data. And we also try to maintain the vocabularies from those data sets that we've imported. So in this example, we have data from Water Quality Portal from the US, and also a specific state data set, main environmental and geographic analysis data set that has some additional PFAS sampling data for the state of Maine. So a third graph that is part of this project is the facilities and industries graph. And this ties into the last explained Contaminoso graph because some features of interest are also facilities. So especially for the case of releases where we know a facility has released a specific chemical into the environment, maybe through a smokestack or into the waterway, or it is a landfill, which might also have ongoing sampling done to measure sort of runoff from that facility. We would link into this facility and industry ontology graph. So this is really about facilities that are sites of commercial or institutional activity, and the type of industry that the activity occurs at that location. So the industry classification code. So each facility has one or more of industry links associated with it using the North American Industry Classification System and also Standard Industry Classification System. And the facilities that we've instantiated are from the US EPA Facility Registry Service, which covers all lower 48 continental states. Here's an example of some instances for one specific facility. So we have an international airport, which has a specific industry code on the right-hand side there of 48811 airport operations. Through our ontology and the property chain that we've added, each of the higher levels of industry group, industry subsector, and industry sector are also inferred. So you can query the industry by any level of specificity about what type of activity is occurring there. And really the goal of this graph is to highlight where activity is happening of a particular type. Particularly with PFAS, we don't always have direct measurements, but we can infer based on specific industries where there might be likely contamination because of the type of activity that is occurring there. But this is also a graph that's useful for a lot of other projects across Proto-OKN. Next slide. And finally, the North American Industry Classification System has very detailed data about different types of industry. It goes up to 5 digits that are agreed upon with the Canada and Mexico, and then the 6th digit, which also the US has some additional levels of detail for some industries. There are a number of websites where these codes are available, including the Census Bureau and also other organizations that host them. This is just a small example of the types of detail that are included in the industry classification.
Hello, I'm David Kedrowski. I'm a PhD student at the University of Maine, also in the Skylab. And I have responsibility for SAWGraph spatial and hydrology graphs. I'm going to talk first about the spatial graph a bit. Within the spatial graph, there's really primarily 2 types of data that we have: administrative regions, which include states, counties, and county subdivisions, and then S2 cells. We include the administrative regions because they're a very common way to think about data. Many users are interested in their specific municipality or political division. We also see that those tend to provide boundaries for where regulations and policies will change and differ. across these types of regions. They're nested. Towns or county subdivisions, which are typically towns or townships, depending on the state you're in, reside within counties. Counties reside within states. And we connect them using a nowhere graph relation administrative part of. And then we have actually added on an extending nowhere graph spatial ontology that we infer the SF within relationship to go along with that administrative part of. In the picture you see there, we have some towns in Maine in black. The counties are in blue. And then we also include level 13 S2 cells. The S2 cell system is really kind of a system of discrete global grids. There's 31 levels from level 0 to level 30. We've chosen level 13 somewhere in the middle. It gives us grids, and you'll see them in the picture there. That's the orange network. They're about 1 square kilometer in area. Their sizes vary a little bit around the globe and across the United States as well. Each of them is connected to 8 neighbors, and we connect them using the nowhere graph relation SF touches. On the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about why we include the S2 cells in addition to the administrative regions. So why include S2 cells? Well, in a graph as large as SAWGraphs, we have a very wide array of features and entities that have geometries. We've already seen a few of the samples of these types of entities from the preceding ontologies. If we try to continue to essentially spatially integrate all entities with each other, we end up with a really, really large graph. So that kind of going through a pre-processing integration process, I guess, for lack of a better word, just creates really, in some sense, an unmanageable number of triples and really unneeded. The other approach you kind of have to dealing with geometries and spatial relations directly is to try to do query time calculations using geosparkle functions and relations. But as we have more and more complex geometries, these become very time consuming and queries no longer run very efficiently. So S2 cells are used as an intermediary. Instead of trying to integrate any kind of geometric feature with all the other types of geometric features, we instead integrate all geometric features with S2 cells. And then we can use the S2 cells, again, as this intermediary. So in the picture that you see there on the right, there's a couple of red dots. Those are a couple facilities, and they are in a red S2 cell. And then we have a neighborhood around that S2 cell. Those are the gray S2 cells. And what we're kind of doing is saying that neighborhood is where we think water bodies are near these facilities. And then you'll see water bodies there, in this case, some streams in the dark blue. So the facilities are integrated with the S2 cells. The flow lines, or the water bodies, are integrated with the S2 cells. And then we use the S2 cells to determine, in this case, proximity of one to the other. You can use these for more than just proximity. We use them for tracing. We use them for intersections. You can use them in a variety of different ways depending on the types of geometries that you are working with. This reduces storage requirements. It makes query time execution very efficient because now instead of trying to deal with complex spatial calculations, we're just doing triple matching. We do lose some precision as a result of this because we're not doing things exactly. But we have found that we still get results that are very good, if not excellent, for data exploration and hypothesis testing as we go along there. I've included a couple of papers, one from the Nowhere Graph people who also use the S2 system, and then one from the SAWGraph team here as well that go into this in more detail if you have more interest. So one other thing that I'd like to mention about the spatial ontology, I did mention that we extended the Nowhere Graph ontology a little bit. Here's another extension of that, actually. We've introduced a new relation called spatial connected to as part of a SAWGraph spatial ontology. And this is a super property for 6 different Nowhere Graph spatial relations. SF contains, crosses, equals, overlaps, touches, and within. Essentially, many users, we assume when they use SAWGraph, won't necessarily know exactly which of these to use and which data set they come from. Being able to simply say connected to will make querying more simple and more efficient for folks. The contains, crosses, more specific ones are still available within the graph though, so if those are needed, they are there and users can still use those. So a nice little extension there to make querying simpler for folks. The next couple of slides I have are going to talk about the hydrology graph. The story of the hydrology graph is really one of integration. Hydrology gets at the idea of surface water, so rivers, streams, lakes, ponds, catchment areas. And we also have to worry about groundwater as well, though, aquifers, wells that tap into those aquifers, hydrogeologic units. And to date, there really has not been much work done. There isn't an ontology, at least that we're aware of, that integrates the surface water and the groundwater. And high features in groundwater markup language are really more schema than ontologies. So there are a variety of efforts going on to kind of get these into useful form for us and also to begin to connect them to each other. The Hydro Foundation ontology, HIFO, has started to do this, and we are expanding it and trying to use it to do more of the integration of the surface water to the groundwater. So SAWGraph brings in data from the states, from federal sources, the USGS, which is where the National Hydrography Dataset Plus comes from, US aquifers, water boundary dataset, et cetera. And we're attaching these ontologically using high features groundwater markup language concepts and those schemas to create this. There's a very high level diagram here that just kind of shows a little bit of the connectivity in general of these different sources of, in some cases, data, and in other cases, classes and relations that we use. This is a work in process, and it involves folks from a variety of different agencies. Our project, we're working across country, international boundaries as well, trying to bring this together. Okay, and then one neat feature of the hydrology ontology specifically is flow lines. I've talked a little bit about the streams and the rivers already. We get this information from what's called the NHD plus V2 data set, and flow lines are just small chunks of rivers and streams. Each one in the NHD is connected to its downstream neighbor, so water flows from one downstream into the next segment. And by making that connectivity between these flow lines transitive, we create a system where we can actually navigate this entire network. So the picture here shows a facility, and similar to the previous picture that I showed a couple of slides ago, we use S2 cells to determine some flow lines that are nearby. They're in dark blue, a little hard to see down there in the left-hand corner. But then we can start to trace downstream from there, and we can also look at the S2 cells that are along the way. And as you get toward Caribou there, if you see that at the top, we start to find some sites of interest that are along the downstream portion of these flow lines. And within a certain distance, in this case, within the size of an S2 cell from those points.
Hi, I'm Adrita. I'm a PhD student at the Department of Computer Science at Kansas State University. I'm working at DAISY Lab. Today, I'll talk about one of the impacts of PFAS contamination on different use cases. Here I've been working on this cropland ontology where we have retrieved data from SAWGraph, where it has information about different crop growing lands and their geospatial locations. So we have retrieved this geospatial data from SAWGraph and integrated to our ontology. And we have further mapped these crop types to crop categories and subcategories with the help of our domain experts. So now we would see information about different crop growing lands and their geospatial location are already listed in SAWGraph, which has distinctions about the cells and county level and state level information attached to it. So you can query the graph saying, suppose you have a PFAS contaminated area, so you can query the graph within that area. Do you have any crop growing land, which are also listed on those areas, or any facilities or wells? Those have data available for PFAS contaminations, and then there are also crop growing around those areas or not. So the broader idea was to see if you have PFAS contamination impact on crop growing lands, what are the type of those crops, and you could also see what are the broader crop categories, like general categories, like food crop, oil crop, etc., and more fine-grained subcategories like grains, nuts, or fruits, vegetables, etc., which should also be listed on those. So this is a small snippet that I have attached. In SAWGraph, different crop types are listed as cropland observable properties. Here, if you have a crop type, which is corn, you'd see what are the areas that these corn growing lands are there. And you can also look up their categories, broader categories, like it is corn, it's a food crop, and more fine-grained subcategories like grain. And you could look up the graph to see on those areas where corn is growing, if there are information listed of PFAS contamination around those areas or not. There is also an ongoing work to map these crop types to food on categories. So food on has information about different food products and the materials those food products are made of. So you could for example, you could now query the graph for a specific food product if it is made from a material which has corn in it, which are the areas where this material is grown specifically, and if it has any land or areas around it which has PFAS contamination. So this was the broader idea of the cropland ontology. Next slide, please. To our efforts to model different data and aligning these data sets within our graph, we have tried to work with another data set which comes from Kansas Department of Health and Environment, KDHE. We have modeled and aligned their data set within our ontology. Here you see in purple are the data points that comes from KDHE, and we have modeled it within our ontology. And this is also an ongoing work. We are trying to get in more data from them. And you'd see in the graph on the map below is that we have modeled and aligned this data set, and you could see in green dots there are suspected PFAS facilities and some overlap within the pink dots, which are the data from KDHE, which also have those facilities which have PFAS contamination. They also have listed some data around those facilities that has PFAS contamination detected from fish fillet. That was a sample in this case, one of the which is popping up in one of the examples. So now you'd see that okay, the PFAS facilities that has suspected for PFAS contaminations also can be integrated to other data set, and then they also have similar overlap between the PFAS contamination areas or facilities and the samples they have been tested on. So that was one of the integrations, and that's all.
This was a short overview of all the Ontologies developed as part of the SAWGraph project. Of course, this is a team effort of many, many people, including domain experts and the government partners. So we want to acknowledge them and thank also the funders. If you have any information, any question, please reach out via email. Thank you.